Have you ever done something that you thought, why in the world did I do that? I kind of thought I might have hit a chord there because I do that quite often. I say things, I do things, and then later I'm like, oh, why did I do that? And then I replay it in my mind over and over again. And it's like, man, what was I thinking? This past week, my son, he's at college down in Arizona, and he sent us a link for their chapel that they had, and he said, you got to listen to this. This sounds like the counseling stuff that you guys do. And so I listened to it, and sure enough, it was very similar to the stuff we do, and so I stole the sermon. So I'm going to give him credit. His name is Steve Carter, and he's from Denver, or not Denver, Chicago area. And so anyway, whenever I heard it, I was like, you know, I got to make it my own because I can't preach somebody else's sermon, but I'm going to use that idea and springboard. So that's what I'm doing this morning. So, why do we do the things that we do not want to do? When you think about it, Paul in Romans chapter 7 had a very similar comment. He said in Romans 7 verses 15 through 20, he says, I do not understand what I do. For what I want to do, I do not do. But what I hate to do, that I do. And if I do what I do not want to do, I agree that the law is good. As it is no longer I myself who do it, but it is sin living in me. For I know that good itself does not dwell in me, that is, in my sinful nature. For I have the desire to do what is good, but I cannot carry it out. For I do not do the good that I want to do, but the evil that I do not want to do, this I keep on doing. Now, if I do what I do not want to do, it is no longer I who do it, but it is sin living in me that does it. So Paul is right along with us. He was struggling with the same thing. So why do we do it? You know, we can determine in our mind, hey, I'm never going to talk like that again. I'm never going to do that again. But yet we do. We keep going back to it. What causes us to do that? And why do we react the way we do? One of the quotes from Steve Carter's lesson was, he said, when we act hysterically, in other words, when we're out of control, when we're not acting the way that we normally would want to act, what causes us to do that? And he says, it usually has a historical reason why. The historical usually causes us to react hysterically. And so, what is the history behind it? Where does it come from? So, in our counseling, we call it triggers. What are the triggers? What caused that feeling? And so that's what we're going to be talking about this morning. But I'd like to start by looking at a story in Genesis chapter 37. It's recorded there in your bulletin, but in Genesis 37, starting with verse 12. Now, his brothers had gone to graze their father's flocks near Shechem. This is speaking of Joseph. And most of you know the story of Joseph and the coat of many colors. And that's the story that we're talking about here. Joseph is the second to youngest of 12 kids. And of these 12 kids, Joseph is the favorite. And he is the one that's liked. So anyway, here's the story. Now his brothers had gone to graze their father's flocks near Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, as you know, your brothers are grazing the flocks near Shechem. Come, I am going to send you to them. Very well, he replied. So he said to him, go and see if all is well with your brothers and with the flocks, and bring word back to me. Then he sent him off from the valley of Hebron. When Joseph arrived at Shechem, a man found him wandering around in the fields and asked him, what are you looking for? He replied, I am looking for my brothers. Can you tell me where they are grazing their flocks? They have moved on from here, the man answered. I heard them say, let's go to Dothan. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan. But they saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. So, why? If you were just to read that part of the story, here's a brother coming to check on you, traveled all of this distance, obviously didn't find you in the first place, so he tracked you down. He comes to where you're at, where you're tending the flock, and he's coming to check on you, and your answer is, let's kill him? That doesn't make any sense at all, does it? It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. That's the hysterical answer. That's the hysterical reply. So what's the history behind it that caused it? If we back up just a little bit to the earlier verses in Genesis 37, I'm going to flip there. In Genesis 37, if we start back in verse 1, oops. If you'd like to turn there with me, you'll have plenty of time. It says in Genesis 37, verse 1, Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. This is the account of Jacob. Jacob is also known as Israel. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah, the sons of Zilpah, his father's wife, and he brought their father a bad report about them. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made a richly ornamented robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. So you see, there's two things that happen right there, and just that little bit of the story. Those two things is that, first of all, he had brought a bad report about his brothers back to his dad. I don't know what that bad report was, but if you've ever had your siblings tell on you when you were doing something you weren't supposed to, that doesn't make good friendships really right away. It tends to kind of sour you just a little bit. That was just one of the things, but having your father declare and show that this other sibling is your favorite, and spoiling that son would kind of sour again. But there was more. There's also the dreams. See, Joseph had some dreams, and in each one of the dreams, it was indicating that his brothers, so he was one of 12, and the other 11 were bowing down to him. The stars, the stalks of wheat, and they are bowing down to this one that is Joseph. And so when he tells these dreams to his brothers, they're like, you think we're going to bow down to you? You think we're going to be servants to you? And so they didn't like him at all. They were very much against him. So you can see in this story that we have a hysterical reaction based on some history that's behind it. So how does that apply to us? To you and I? Miguel and I were talking during the break about some of the things that we sometimes do or say that we're like, oh boy, I shouldn't have done that. I got to go back and apologize for that, or I should straighten that one up, you know. And why do we do it? And what causes us to do it? We call those triggers. In your bulletin, you'll have some notes there that is just a kind of a reminder more than anything. But we created an acrostic that if you'll look at the first one here, it says, going down, trains, triggers. So the triggers are what causes us to react. So if somebody says something that might be considered mean, what is it that triggers it? So for me, I'll give you some hints. So don't ever do this, because I might still react wrong. But if you call me stupid, if you call me dumb, that's one of my triggers. So when you do that, it hits a trigger in me. And so you have to ask, where does it come from? So everybody has different triggers. Everybody has different things. And sometimes those triggers develop into hair triggers. Mine is when somebody says, duh. You know, they didn't say anything. They just said, duh. So that hair trigger, it's like, okay, you just called me dumb. That wasn't what they were saying. And sometimes when Rhonda did that one time, and she said, what did I just do? And And I said, well, you just said duh. And she said, I was talking about myself. I wasn't even talking about you. So sometimes those hair triggers can be so sensitive that we respond negatively without even having a real reason to do so. So what is your trigger? How do we know? Well, look at it this way. If we act hysterically without reason, what was behind that? What was the cause of it? If we act out, or we speak out, or we do things or say things that we shouldn't be, then you have to stop and ask yourself, what's behind it? And that's how you identify your trigger. You identify the trigger, what it is that sends you on your way, and you say, okay, where's it coming from? And so there's some things that we usually do. The second one in the trains is retreat. So some of us will respond by retreating. We want to run away from it. We don't want to deal with it. Sometimes it leads to depression. Sometimes it leads to us closing ourselves off or just shutting down. So we retreat into ourselves or into something else, and we become separate from the situation. And that might be the way that we respond. So if you do that, you want to ask, what just triggered me? What just happened? Another way that we respond is with anger. We lash out, we blow up, we become mean because of the things that we say or do. We blow up, we become angry. So when we have triggers, we have that retreat or anger. And then another way we just show this is in the insecurity. What causes us to be insecure? I believe that Satan is active and alive today, and I believe that he tries to tear us down, to cause us to have issues. So if he can give us some insecurity, you're not good enough, you're dumb, you've made too many mistakes, you're a bad person, whatever it is, if he can create those insecurities in our heart that cause us to feel badly about ourselves, it doesn't take much for somebody to trigger that, does it? It can easily hit that trigger and cause us to go over the top. Another thing is negative self-talk. This often comes from some of these other responses. When we have negative self-talk, we are actually abusing ourselves. I call it self-abuse. Because when somebody else convinces us that we're stupid or dumb or whatever it might be, and then we start telling ourselves, yeah, that's true. That's right. When I was in 4th grade, I won't go into all the details, but I got off on a bad track and I was having a hard time in school, and I got behind in my reading, so they put me in a special reading class. And so I convinced myself that there it is, there's proof. I'm dumb because I have to be in this special reading class, so I must be stupid, you know. So when you can see how you can easily create that negative self-talk. With that negative self-talk, then you start believing that, and you start acting that way, and you start convincing yourself that this is the way it is. And so when we have those triggers, we want to retreat or we become angry, we have the insecurities that we deal with, we also deal with that negative self-talk. But the final one in trains is sin. When we get to a point where we feel like, oh, what's the use anymore? Then we give in to sin. We give in or we give up. And we begin to return to addictions or habits, or we continue to exist in depression, or we retreat into ourselves and we don't want to have fellowship with others. And that sin takes a hold of our lives. And what we want to do is figure out what's causing it. Why do we want to know what's causing it? If we can figure out where it's coming from, they say that 90% of the problem is 90% of the answer is figuring out what the problem is. If you can figure out where your trigger is, then you can be able to deal with it and resolve it. Kind of one of the funny things of the story of Joseph is that when Joseph goes away, when he was taking away, his brothers, instead of killing him, sell him to the gypsies that are traveling through. The gypsies haul him to Egypt and sell him as a slave. And so for years he is a slave down in Egypt. He ends up in prison because he's falsely accused. In prison, he becomes the head of the prisoners and helps the prison guard so much that he is praised as being a model inmate, we would say today. But he is so good at that. Then he ends up interpreting the dreams of the king. And when he does, then he is made second in command behind the Pharaoh or king of that day of Egypt. And when he is in that position, he, knowing because God told him that there was going to be 7 years of good and then 7 years of famine, so he tells the king, what we should do is lay up during this next 7 years, and then we'll have plenty for the 7 years to follow. Well, guess what? Whenever the 7 years of famine comes, people begin to get desperate, and they begin selling their possessions. They begin giving things, even the land, to Joseph as the curator for the king, and he takes over all of these lands. So what happens? His brothers say, well, there's food down in Egypt. Let's go down there. Not knowing that he is still alive, not thinking of him being the second in command. And they show up, and he sees them, and he knows who they are. And now I want you to talk about triggers for just a minute. Would that not be a trigger for you? Here's my brothers that sent me into slavery and imprisonment, and now they're coming to me for food. And I know that he had to have had some thoughts in the back of his mind that was saying, man, this is my chance. And he even doesn't tell them who he is at first. He sends them back and puts the gold back in each of their bags as he sends them home with grain. They get back and they're like, what is this? And they can't figure out why they have these bags of gold back. And then the second trip they go back to take the younger brother, and he gets to see his younger brother. And for the first time, he breaks down and he realizes that these are his brothers. He once again has mercy and grace on them. And so then he shows them that grace. So the second part of our puzzle here is, how do we deal with the things when we find the triggers, when we are able to identify what they are? The first part is, and the acronym is GRACE. The first part is giving grace to others. When we recognize the fact that we are not perfect, that we fail, that we make mistakes, it's easier to give someone else grace when they make mistakes. It's easier to look at somebody else and say, you know, I understand where they're coming from. But we don't usually do that, do we? We don't usually do that because our first reaction is to react to the trigger instead of responding. We react and we blow up, or we get angry, or we shut down, or whatever the response is that you personally do. And it's like, why are we doing that? It's because we haven't realized that we need to give grace to other people when they make mistakes. And the second part of that is receiving grace from God. Now you might say, why did I put that second? Because of the fact that sometimes it's a separate issue. God gives us grace. God gives everyone grace. But we don't receive it. Why don't we receive it? Because of that negative self-talk, because of the insecurity that Satan puts in our hearts that says, you're not worthy, you're not good enough, you've sinned, you've fallen short. Why would you even think that God would love you? Why would he care enough to give you grace? So we shut down. Oftentimes, we shut down and we do not accept the grace that God offers us. So giving grace to others and receiving the grace from God. But then third is accepting the truth about God's love for you. Whenever we look at people in the world, we get angry sometimes, we get upset, sometimes we get frustrated with where the situation is, and we have a hard time loving them. But when we look at what God did, what did he do? It says, while you were yet sinners, Christ died for you. If he loved you enough to die for you when you were his enemy, while we were yet enemies, he died for you. Now that you are children of God, now that you are sons and daughters of God, how much more would God do for you? He says that, man, we give good gifts to our children. How much more would God give to us? How much does he care about you? He cares enough to send his one and only Son to die for us. If he did that, how much would he do for us now that we're walking with him? Oh yeah, we make mistakes, we stumble, we fall. Satan wants to capitalize on that. He wants to convince us that we're not good enough. But when we can truly accept God's love, truly understand how much he wants you to have a relationship with him, it changes everything. For me, it's the picture of the prodigal son who has made so many mistakes. He's failed so badly. He's caused his father great pain, and he stole the money and ran away and spent it all, and now he's coming back. And in his mind, he's saying, if he will only let me be his slave, the worst job is better than what I have now. So if he can just let me come back as a slave. But what was the response? The father ran to him, wrapped his arms around him, said, welcome home. And the son's pushing him away. No, you don't understand. You don't know what I've done. You don't know what happened to me. You see that negative self-talk and that insecurity coming through? He's saying, I'm not good enough. And he falls down on his knees, and his dad says, no, stand up. He said, go get him a new robe. Go get a ring for him. Kill the fatted calf. I want to celebrate. My son was dead, and now he's alive. He was lost, and now he's found. I want to celebrate. That's the picture of God's love for you. That's how much he cares for you. That's what he wants, is that relationship with you. So instead of listening to Satan, we want to listen to God and hear how much he loves you. And the C in grace is creating good thoughts to replace the bad things. Rhonda started a few years ago a 1,000 Gifts journal, where she wrote down 1,000 things that she was thankful for throughout the year. Each day, I think it's like three things a day equals 1,000 by the end of the year. And so she began to do that. That's been 11 years ago now, and every year she's been writing down this. What does that do? It replaces the negative thoughts with the positive. When we recognize how much God loves us and cares about us, and we record it, or we write it down, or we think about it, or every time we have an opportunity to thank God for the things that he's done for us, remember what he's done and thank him for it, then we are replacing those negative thoughts with the positive thoughts, and remembering all that he's done for us. And finally, the E in grace is entrust God with our lives. In Ephesians, he talks about surrendering or giving up of our own desires. He also mentions in Galatians 2 and 20 that we die to ourselves and we live for him. When we entrust God with our lives, the Creator, the one who knows our every thought, everything that we experience, he knows it, he understands it. He came and walked on this earth. He dealt with the same things that we deal with. He even experienced pain. He experienced death. He knows all of these things. He can feel and understand where you're at. Can you trust him with your life, knowing that he knows what's in the future, what's ahead? We make mistakes. We fail. We misguess on things. If you were to ask me to be your financial counselor, I could pretty much assure you that I could lose most of your money. I can do that. But God knows the future. He knows all things. And I believe that God cares about us enough to bless us in those areas and help us when we trust him. The Steve Carter, when he was giving this lesson, he mentioned that in Chicago, that they actually have a 3-number phone number that you can call to report potholes. I thought that was kind of funny, but when you dial 311 in Chicago, you actually get the pothole hotline. And what it is there are, because of their freezing and thawing, they create potholes. And so you can actually call in to 311 and they will say, where are you reporting your pothole? And you can tell them where the location is of the pothole. Now, if your car is damaged because you hit a pothole and somebody else has already reported it and it's been so much time, they will actually pay for the damage in your vehicle. So it's worth calling if it's actually an old pothole that's been there for a long time. And so there's benefit for you, but also to the city of Chicago, because they go out and do repairs. And they'll go out and they have, he said, you want to guess how many potholes there are? And he says in the last 100 days, there was 137,000 potholes filled in 100 days. So now you know why there's a 3-letter or 3-number for the reporting these things. But they repaired it and get it smoothed over, and then you could drive on the road again. But so there's something that happens or has happened in the past where there's been another cause for the pothole, and they've gone in and they've just resurfaced it. And there's been a water main that was leaking underneath and washing out the roadway underneath. And they didn't attend to that. And whole cars have driven in to these big potholes. I've seen some videos of these on YouTube, and you can see them. And it's kind of scary to think, you'd be driving along and all of a sudden you just sink into this big hole. But if we don't take care of the things that are on the surface, or if we only take care of the surface and we don't deal with what's underneath, we could potentially have something going on underneath that gets so big that it could devour us. And that's the reason why we want to look for these triggers, to find the things that we are responding negatively about and say to ourselves, where is that coming from? Why does that happen? If you have an addiction, if you have a habit, if you have something that you have a go-to, what is it? Why do you go there? Find out, because underneath that is usually a problem that can be solved. And as we've demonstrated with these this acronym of GRACE, that when we recognize these things and we can resolve them, then we can begin to have healing in these areas where we can actually enjoy the life. So what happened back in Genesis? In Genesis chapter 50, I'm going to find it here. In Genesis chapter 50, 15 through 20. Have you noticed that that in Genesis chapter 37 it was 15 through 20, and in Romans chapter 7 it was verses 15 through 20. Now it's in Genesis chapter 50 and it's 15 through 20. And this is what it says. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "What if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all of the wrongs that we did to him?" So they sent word to Joseph, saying, "Your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you are to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs that they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of the God of your father." When their message came to him, Joseph wept. Why? Why did he weep? Well, here's why. Verse 18. His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. "We are your slaves," they said. But Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives."
Amen.
What changed his heart? Recognizing the fact that just like himself, they made mistakes. recognizing that God forgave him, and he forgives others. Helping them to see that all of these lies that they've been told, that they've been thinking about themselves, is not true. That he loves them. They're his brothers. He cares about them. He wants good for them. When he recognized all of these things, and he begins to share with them that, no, you're not my slave. You think I'm God? I'm not God. He says to them, you are my family. And so he has accepted God's love. He has accepted God's grace. And because of that, he begins to share that with others. And he gets to trust his life, trusting God to know the best. He says, even what you had planned for evil, God intended for good. And he turned it back and showed that God was in control and not them. So many times in our lives, we do things that we don't even realize why we're doing it. We respond in ways that we don't want to respond. But when we can figure out what's behind it, to resolve those things and to help one another, then we can enjoy the life that God has for us.